Hello and welcome to the JSA Studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today I'm coming at you with a reaction to Week 9 from the Big Ten perspective. We're going to be talking about every team in the Big Ten as we do every week. Unfortunately, this video is going to be a little bit shorter than my normal video as I am a bit strapped for time. Now, before we get into the video proper, I am going to ask you at this time to like, comment, and subscribe. It would really help out the channel if you did it. And now, with the intro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to do, and that is to get started by starting with the treading water tier. There are 5 teams in this treading water tier: USC, Rutgers, who played each other, Washington, UCLA, and Purdue. Let's go ahead and start with USC and Rutgers as they played each other. This game did not particularly change my opinion of either of these teams. Rutgers has, unfortunately, very much so let me down this season. I thought when they started 4-1 and beat Washington that they were going to make a bowl game. That's likely off the table at this point. USC, again, another very disappointing team. They have actually performed worse than I expected them to do at the beginning of the year, and I expected them to underperform at the beginning of the year. I thought they would go 8-4 still, and at that point, that is unlikely given their future schedule. Moving on to Washington. Cool. You kept it close. You looked like a competently coached football team, which is more than I can say about the other two teams that I haven't talked about yet, against Indiana with their backup quarterback. That was cool. I understand it. You had a solid chance to win with the backup quarterback. You lost by the margin that was anticipated. This is a very, very, very good Indiana team. They are one of the 10 best teams in the country, most likely, and losing to them is no shame upon your program. Purdue and UCLA, at this point, it doesn't matter what you do. Now, you both had bye weeks this week, I believe, but there's basically nothing that you can do that will make me change my opinion on these teams this year. Purdue, you're likely looking for a new head coach. UCLA, you were looking towards next year anyway. Up next is the Scarlett Johansson tier. Why is it called the Scarlett Johansson tier? Well, because these teams look pretty. Indiana, Minnesota, Oregon, Iowa, and Penn State. I'll start with Indiana, as they are the team that I just so happen to put on the left side of the graphic. Indiana, winning a game against a quality coach team with your backup quarterback in is an accomplishment. And that's the main reason that you're here in the Scarlett Johansson tier. This is a very, very good team. I don't know what the timetable to get Rourke back is. The quarterback, I think that's his name, Rourke. He transferred from Ohio. He won, I think, 2 MAC championships with Ohio. Very good player. Probably a draftable prospect at this point in time. Not before day 3, but a draftable quarterback prospect. Getting him back, hopefully before the Ohio State game at a minimum, will be a big help to this team. And to be honest with you, I don't know what's going to happen this week with Ohio State-Penn State game. I think Ohio State's probably going to win just because Penn State can't beat Ohio State no matter what they do. But Ohio State is not the team that we all thought they were. I can't believe that they didn't destroy Nebraska. That team and its utter ineptitude, partially in coaching and partially just because there are a lot of players that are not as good as people are acting like they are in terms of Ohio State's roster. That game is a very winnable game for Indiana. There's a real possibility that Indiana goes to Ohio State and wins that game, even if they beat Penn State, like they probably should, okay? Even if they beat Penn State, there's a real possibility that you can go to Ohio State and win that game because you might just flat out and straight up be a better team than Ohio State. Minnesota on the next team will stay along the top row and then move to the bottom 2 teams. Minnesota, you destroyed Maryland this week. This is a game that a lot of people, including myself, thought would be closer than it ended up being. This team is 2 plays away from being a 1-loss football team if you make the field goal against UNC, and if that bullshit penalty against Michigan on the onside kick isn't called, which it shouldn't have been called. It was an incorrect calling. This team is 7-1 and probably ranked inside the top 20 with an outside shot at the Big Ten championship game and potentially the college football playoff. As you play Illinois this week, then you play Rutgers, then you have Penn State at home, and you end the season with the rivalry game against Wisconsin as per the norm. Now, that's a relatively difficult schedule. A ranked Illinois team, a better-than-average Rutgers team, a top-5 Penn State team, and a Wisconsin team that appears to have turned the corner from a program perspective. That's a difficult schedule. It is. You should really only feel confident heading into the Rutgers game. All of the other games, I don't know. Now, do I think you're better than Illinois? I don't know. I think that's a 50-50 game. Genuinely, I do. I think Illinois is a quality football team. I think they got embarrassed this week. I think coming back home for that team will be good for them. And I believe that there's a real possibility that they can win that game. However, the way you've been playing the past few weeks, really since the Michigan game, has been at a higher level than beforehand. You seem to have found something at the quarterback position with Brosmere, I believe is his name, or Brosmer. I don't remember. But your quarterback played really well in the part of the game that I watched. And I think there's a definitive possibility you run the table. And if you do, again, outside shot at the Big Ten championship. Now, I wouldn't give you more than a 5 or 10% chance at running the table because you do play Penn State. But you could go 3 out of 4 fairly easily, mainly because PJ Fleck is a really fucking good football coach. Genuinely. Really fantastic football coach. Moving on to Oregon. I didn't think you would beat Illinois that bad. You did. I think right now you are clearly the number 1 team in the country. I don't particularly think it's close. This week is tougher than people are going to be talking about. Traveling the 3 time zones to East Coast time is very, very difficult, okay? And Michigan, they beat Michigan State. They're feeling high. It just means that they're ready to get slapped down again, in my opinion. However, the line only being 2 touchdowns opening up is kind of interesting. That kind of says that Michigan might put up more of a fight than a lot of people are anticipating. Now, that being said, you should win really all 4 of your games pretty easily. The most concerning game is not the rivalry with Washington, because I think you handle business there at home. The most concerning game is Wisconsin on the road, because that game is the textbook definition of a program-building win for Luke Fickell in Wisconsin, the way that Wisconsin has been playing this year. I'm not going to talk about that here because I'm going to talk about that in the Wisconsin section of this video, which is the last thing we're going to do before the rankings. I'm going to keep it positive here, and I'm not going to talk about if you lost if you're an Oregon fan, okay? This team is flat out and straight up, in my opinion, one of the 2 teams that are national championship contending teams in the Big Ten. And I'm going to talk about the other one later on in this segment. So if you're a fan of a particular fan base, you might want to skip ahead to the next section if you want to hear me talk about that. Getting back to Oregon, I've deviated twice now. I'm going to stay on topic from here on out until I move on to Iowa. Okay. Oregon, you have Heisman contender at the quarterback position. He's probably going to be a finalist if you end up 12-0, which you should. Probably going to be a finalist. He's not going to win it, because he's not the best quarterback in college football. You can make the argument he's number 2, but he's sure as shit not number 1. That's Cam Ward. Okay, so you're not going to win it, but there's a possibility that you have a finalist, and also a defense that has been getting better, especially than it was early on in the season, with an offensive line that is incredibly underrated and a running game that is incredibly underrated, especially your running back position. I think you've got a lot of talent there. So this is a team that I think can win by playing Big Ten bully ball if they need to, and can also compete with a pass-first explosive offense like a Georgia or a Texas. or to a lesser extent, like a Miami or BYU if you end up matching up against them in the playoffs. But this team would have to severely fumble the bag not to make the playoffs, and this team would have to severely fumble the bag not to make the Big Ten championship game. You should end up 12-0. You should be headed, I believe it's still in Indianapolis. You should be headed to Indianapolis, relatively confident that you're going to play either Ohio State or Penn State, depending upon who wins that game, unless Penn State beats Ohio State, and this is chaos, and it's why I don't like the idea of a divisionless conference, especially when you have 18 teams in it. However, there's a real possibility if Indiana beats Ohio State and Penn State beats Ohio State, which is very unlikely, but still a possibility, that we have 3 12-0 undefeated Big Ten teams, and only two of them, rather, can make the Big Ten championship game. And if that happens, I don't know how it works out in the tiebreakers. It'll probably come down to margin of victory, in which case I think Indiana would get in, and I don't know how you and Penn State would figure out how to get in. So there's a not impossible scenario where you're 12-0, you beat Ohio State, you run the table in the Big Ten in your first year in the Big Ten, and you don't make the Big Ten championship game because that's just the way that it works. And that would be horrible because there should be like a West version of the Big Ten, like we used to have, and an East version of the Big Ten, like we used to have, so that you're not flying out to Michigan and Purdue and fucking Wisconsin 3 or 4 times a year. I don't think you should have to do that because this season has proven that is not something that teams can do consistently and expect to win. Now, I think you're an exception to that rule, but it's not necessarily something you're going to be an exception to every single year. And those are my thoughts on Oregon. Moving on to Iowa, I did not think you were going to win as easily as you did. However, I did not also think you were going to get competent quarterback play because I didn't think you were going to bench Cade McNamara. Sullivan injected this team with life. His ability to scramble and get yards on the ground is game-changing for this team. If he had been starting the whole year, I think this team is in a much, much better position. I think he should be the starter going forward, and if he isn't, that is malpractice by the coaching staff. All that being said, he is so much better than Cade McNamara. Like, he's so much better than Cade McNamara. It's actually hilarious how much better he is. I cannot believe that he was not playing more consistently than this past week. He needs to be the starter going forward because he's probably going to be your starter next year. Cade McNamara fucking ain't. He also ain't going to get drafted and play in the NFL. So why are you playing him? Going forward, he should absolutely be the guy. Moving on to the last team in the Scarlett Johansson tier, Penn State. I am going to spend an exuberant amount of time talking about you this Friday. So this is pretty much all I got to say about you. Right now, I'm going to tell you a little bit more in the rankings section of this video. However, right now I've got to say this. I think flat out and straight up, you are a better team than Ohio State. That doesn't mean you're going to win the game. That doesn't mean I'm going to predict you to win the game. But I think you're a better team than Ohio State. I think Ohio State has some actual, literal, fatal flaws that you are built to expose. If you are a Penn State fan, I highly recommend you subscribe and hit the bell so you get notified when I upload the video on Friday. This is the all right tier. And I'm going to say that as neutral as I can, because all right has 3 different meanings for each of these teams. For Ohio State, it's all right. For Illinois, it's all right. And for Nebraska, it's all right. So that's kind of what this tier is. This is the all right tier. All right. Ohio State, your all right was kind of a disappointed neutral version of the word. Okay. I cannot overstate how not good I think Nebraska is. I don't think they're bad. I think they are an average to above average football team. But what I don't think they are is good. Indiana fucking destroyed this team on the road. You barely beat them at home. Okay? Now, was part of that Nebraska looking ahead to play you and kind of looking over Indiana? Maybe. A little bit. But still, I don't think it should have been that close. Genuinely. That was awful. And by the way, that was in fact targeting at the end of the game. That is, by the definition of the rule, targeting. Okay, you hit a defensive player in the head, that is targeting. Whether your helmet is involved or not is irrelevant. They did a very good job of explaining it on the broadcast. That was, in fact, targeting. Now, all that being said, it was obvious to anyone alive that Nebraska was not going to drive down the field and win that game. It's a fact of reality. The only way Nebraska had a chance was if you never scored again after they went up 17-4. That was the only time they had a chance. You scored, the game was over. You won anyway. But I can't believe Nebraska scored 17 points on you. What happened to the defense? That is not the same defense that it was last year. That defense last year holds Nebraska maybe to 0 points, if not a field goal or two. Like 6 points max. This was a tremendously disappointing game for you. Now, whether or not you beat Penn State or Indiana or whatever is not the topic of this video. It's talking about this past week, and I am disappointed with your performance. Moving on to Illinois. Your all right was kind of just like a shrug your shoulders. All right. And then you move on. This week is the most important game of your season, in my opinion. This week, you play the best team that you have left on the schedule in Minnesota. And then you play Michigan State, which would then be the best team that you have left on your schedule after that. Okay? So these next 2 weeks are going to go a long, long way to see if you can get to that 10-2 margin. Because that shouldn't be the goal. That should be the expectation for this team. You played very bad against Oregon. I thought you would play better. You didn't. You played bad. Minnesota is not Oregon. I don't think they're as good defensively, and they're sure shit not good as good offensively. I think there's a very real possibility that going to the West Coast hurt you more than I thought it was going to. Well, you're at home now, and your road games are Northwestern, which is a couple miles north, and Rutgers, which is like a 2-hour flight. So not that big of a deal, all things considered, travel-wise. But you're home against Minnesota, you're home against Michigan State. You have to win these 2 games. And if you do it, you got a real good chance at 10-2. Nebraska, even though I talked shit about you during the Ohio State section, I'm now going to say good things about you. This game proves that you can play with the big dogs. Or at least it's not entirely unreasonable to think that this game proved that you could play with the big dogs. I'm not sure Ohio State's all that big of a dog anymore. I think they're going to beat Penn State this week, maybe, and probably they should beat Indiana as well. However, Indiana, kind of like Penn State, in my opinion, is a pretty bad matchup for what this team has become in Ohio State. So we'll talk about more of that when the time fucking comes, okay? I get it. But moving back to Nebraska here. This was never about this year, okay? You're not that talented of a football team. In terms of talent in the Big Ten, you're about middle of the pack. You don't have playmakers on offense. You just don't. You don't have an explosive running back. Your offensive line is middle of the pack in the Big Ten. And your wide receivers are nothing special. You've got to go out and get some guys, whether that's recruiting, whether that's in the transfer portal. You got to get some explosive pieces on offense because Dylan Raiola is going to be that guy. It doesn't matter so much this year because he's not that guy yet, but he's going to be that guy. I have utter confidence that if he's this good as a true freshman, he's going to get better next year, and he's going to get better the year after that, and he'll probably be a Heisman contending #1 overall pick type of player. You're going to get there. It was never about this year. This year was about making a bowl game so you get those extra practices. And you're sitting at 5-3 right now, but you've got UCLA at home this week. That should get you to 6 wins. You then go on the road to USC, Don't know how I feel about that game. You bring Wisconsin to Nebraska. Don't know how I feel about that game. And then you go to Iowa. And I don't know how I feel about that game with the new quarterback for Iowa. So 6-6 isn't off the table. But that still gets you to a bowl game. And that was the only goal you had this year was bowl game. That's it. You got to take care of business against UCLA this week. Moving on to the ass tier. This is pretty self-explanatory. These two teams played like ass. Northwestern, you got absolutely embarrassed by Iowa. Michigan State, you couldn't capitalize on two dominatingly long and statement-type drives at the beginning of the game. You didn't fucking capitalize. Then, instead of taking the W after Michigan fucks up an extra point, you decide to drop back with your quarterback that has been known to make poor decisions and not protect the ball well against a pass rush that is teeing off and one of the 10 best in college football. That was a horrible coaching decision. And another thing that I want to say about the coaching staff real quick. The game plan for Michigan should be we're keeping in 6 people to help block against the pass rush. And we're going to chuck the fucking ball because Michigan cannot defend the pass. If they don't get a sack, there are players open every goddamn play for chunk gains. Okay? And you came out and you said, we're going to fucking run the football. And this is something that so many teams have done with Michigan. And I don't know why they keep doing it. The pass defense is the problem. The run defense isn't great. It's ranked like 38th in the country. But it's all right still. The pass game is fucking atrocious. They're ranked in the triple digits in the pass game. You've got to take advantage of that. And their only player that could consistently cover people, Will Johnson, was hurt and didn't fucking play. The game plan for this game was horrible by Jonathan Smith. He completely shit the bed. Now, you've still got a very good chance to make a bowl game. You're probably not going to beat Indiana this week, unless you do, in which case, awesome for you. Bad for the rest of college football, but awesome for you. Then you play Illinois, and that game, you never know. You could put up points with Illinois. Could be a shootout. Who knows? Then you bring Purdue to East Lansing, and you bring Rutgers to East Lansing in your final 2 games. You should win both of those games. So a bowl game is still very much on the table for this team. However, that is still a very disappointing loss. The lone team in the super ass category is Maryland, and oh baby, oh boy, this has got to be it for Loxley, right? This has to be the last straw, because you needed that win to get to a bowl game, because you're going to lose to Oregon, you're probably going to lose to Iowa, and you're almost certainly going to lose to Penn State. So you've got 3 L's on your schedule. That puts you at 5-7, and you can't keep Loxley around. You just can't if he can't even make a bowl game. So he's going to have to pull off an upset with one of these few games that you've got left here, because, man, you can't not make a bowl game in like year, 5 or 6? It's bad. It's real, real bad for this team right now, and that's why you are in the super ass tier, because that's where you are right now. You are super ass. Last thing we're going to do here, we're going to talk about 2 teams individually. Michigan and later Wisconsin. Now, not to overstate what happened Saturday night, but that win probably saved Sharon Moore's job. I genuinely think Michigan might have had no choice but to fire him if he failed to make a bowl game. They now have a very good chance to make a bowl game. Now, they're not going to beat Oregon, they're not going to beat Indiana, and they're not going to beat Ohio State. However, there's a very real possibility if Davis Warren can be as good as he was against Michigan State, which I don't know if he can be or not. However, if he can be as good as he was this week, Michigan might be able to keep it close with an Oregon team that's traveling 3 time zones. They might be able to potentially do something to an Indiana team that just doesn't have the talent, or at least on paper doesn't have the talent that Michigan has. They're not going to win either of those games. They should beat Northwestern at this point, assuming Davis Warren can, in fact, play like you did against Michigan State. And Ohio State, you never fucking know. It's a rivalry game, but almost certainly no. However, the bowl game will help Sharon Moore a lot. A, it decreases the likelihood of them being able to fire him, because then who's going to be the head coach afterwards, okay? B, it helps in the fact that he's going to have like 6 weeks to prepare for a bowl game. So that would be his resume for next season, and being like, hey, if I can put together a competent, well-coached football team with a good game plan, then maybe we could start doing that next year as well with new coordinators, okay? Maybe we can start doing that. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but Davis Warren should be the starting quarterback going forward. The run game is atrocious. I don't think it's going to get better because the offensive line is horrible. And this past week, say what you want to, again, about Khalil Mullings and Donovan Edwards, because it's been a debate. Donovan Edwards was very clearly the better running back this past week. The offensive line was atrocious, but Donovan Edwards, I think, averaged like 3.8 yards per carry, and Khalil Mullings averaged like less than 2. Okay, he just was not effective last week. The run game as a whole was not effective. And that's happened several times this year where the run game has not been effective. Against Illinois, the run game wasn't great either. Both running backs were ass against Illinois, although, again, I would say Donovan Edwards was just slightly better. Okay, the fact of the matter is that this team is not going to give Khalil Mullings 25 to 30 carries a game, and they're not going to give Donovan Edwards 25 to 30 carries a game because they still want to pass the ball. And you have to pass the ball because the offensive line is not good enough just to run the ball. You see a lot of people on Twitter like, oh, it should just be Penn State every week. Okay, Michigan would not get a first down if they went Penn State mode 2023 every single game. That's not going to happen, and it can't happen if they're even going to get to a bowl game, which is fairly likely, as I said. But it's not unbelievable that Michigan could lose the final 4 games and end up 5-7. But before we move on to talking about next week here, because I do have a little bit to say about that, winning this game was very important for Sharon Moore because it kept the fan base from flipping on him. If he lost this game, it's going to be more than just me and a loud minority of people that want him fired. It would have flipped to, it would have been a very, I think, small, if I'm being honest with you, like less than 15% of the fan base that would want Sharon Moore to come back, because at that point a bowl game is completely and utterly off the table, and I don't know if we could stomach that as a fan base. I think we can stomach 6-6 and playing some bullshit team in a bowl game that nobody cares about. I think this fan base could stomach that, even though they shouldn't. And we talk about, you see guys like Steve Dace and, Isaiah Hull and a couple of other Michigan insiders who are just like, this year doesn't matter. We won the national championship last year. Wrong. This year matters more than any other season in the history of Michigan football other than the time that they won the national championship, which was last year. Okay, this is the second most important season in the history of Michigan football, and we failed it. It was an F-, and it will not change from being an F-. The bare minimum expectations for like a C- grade was 8-4. Okay, and that's barely passing. And they sure as shit aren't getting to 8-4. So my opinion of this team and my opinion of what they should do with Sharon Moore remains unchanged. However, I understand if you aren't me. I understand if you don't set expectations before the season. I understand all of those things. So if you want Sharon Moore back, that's fine. I still don't. It would take him getting to 8-4 or beating Ohio State and getting Bryce Underwood in order for me to be okay with him coming back next year. Because another fact of reality here, Sharon Moore will never, in his entire coaching career, have a roster as talented as this one. He will never have 4 or 5 first-round picks on this defense again. He will never have draftable offensive linemen, 2 draftable running backs, a first-round tight end again. That's not going to happen. As well as several players at the wide receiver position that I actually think are NFL type of guys, but the passing game is so ass that it doesn't matter. My opinion on Sharon Moore remains thoroughly unchanged. unless he can pull off an upset against one of these top 15 teams that we're going to be playing in the next few weeks. And I highly, highly doubt this team is going to do that. This game was awesome. Beating the rival is always fun, but it does not signal to me that this is a program going in the correct direction. If this was coming off a bye week, maybe then. But we're not coming off a bye week. We came out of bye week and shit ourselves against Illinois. So this is still not a team that is going in the correct direction, in my opinion. Final thing before we do the rankings here, and I'm going to be a little bit more quicker about this because I do have to leave in the next 28 minutes. So, yeah. And I had to edit and upload this. So I'm kind of down to the wire here. But Wisconsin, it's a tough loss. You were there in the first half, but don't forget what the rest of the season has been, okay? This year was a building year. Next year is the year you compete. This year was a building year. The main thing I wanted to highlight with you is that even though you're 5-3 and Michigan is 5-3, you are heading in completely different directions as a program. And I want you to appreciate that because I do. Wisconsin has met my expectations for this season. It is one of the very few teams to have done that so far this year. Really quickly, power rankings here. Number 1, Oregon. And I have flipped Penn State and Ohio State. And that may be foreshadowing for the video on Friday. It may or may not be. Take that at your own discretion. Number 2, Penn State. Number 3, Ohio State. Number 4, Indiana. 5, Illinois. 6, Wisconsin remains unchanged. Minnesota up 1 spot, largely because of how impressive they were. Nebraska down 1 spot because I do think Minnesota is a better team than you right now. Iowa up 3 spots, Washington down 1, Michigan up 3 spots, Michigan State down 2, USC down 2 spots, Rutgers down 1 spot, Northwestern remains the same, UCLA up 1 spot, Maryland down 1 spot, Purdue remains idle as the worst team in the Big Ten, in my opinion. My top 15 looks like this. Oregon, Georgia remain idle at 1 and 2. Penn State and Ohio State, once again, flip positions. Penn State at 3, Ohio State at 4. It now matches the AP poll. Number 5, I have Texas. Number 6, I have Notre Dame. Number 7, I have Clemson up 1 spot, as is Tennessee and Iowa State up 1 spot to 8 and 9 respectively. Indiana is up 3 spots to number 10. Miami remains idle at 11, as does BYU at 12. Boise State up 1 spot to 13. Texas A&M is being in from unranked, and Pittsburgh remains idle at 15 after starting 8-0. And the group of 5 pick, if not Boise State, is Army, as it has been for the past few weeks. And that's just me. And what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. To this point, I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with me at any point, you can go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And now with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.